The old man didn't move. He just sat there in that creaking rocking chair, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin coffee mug, eyes fixed on the horizon like he was watching something nobody else could see. Maybe a memory, maybe a ghost, maybe the face of every man he'd ever put in the ground. "You deaf, old-timer." The younger man, 20-something, boots too new, attitude too loud, stepped closer. Behind him, 3 others spread out like they practiced this. Like this was a game. "We said get off this porch. This land's been sold. You got 1 minute before we help you leave." The old man took a slow sip of his coffee. A woman across the dusty street pulled her child inside and locked the door. The shopkeeper flipped his sign to closed without looking up. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Because the people of Redemption Creek knew something these strangers didn't. They knew whose porch this was. They knew what that man had survived. What, and who, he had buried. They knew that the last time someone had spoken to Elias Cole that way, 4 men had ridden into this town, and only one rode out. In a box. The old man finally looked up. His eyes, pale gray, still sharp as a blade kept oiled in a drawer, settled in the young man's face without anger, without fear. Just a quiet, ancient calm that was somehow more terrifying than any rage. He set down his coffee cup. "Son," he said softly, "you just made the last mistake you'll ever make standing up." Redemption Creek was the kind of town that remembered everything. It remembered the drought of 1887 that killed 17 cattle ranchers and broke 4 families into dust. It remembered the flood of 1901 that swallowed the old church whole, leaving nothing behind but a bronze bell sitting in 6 feet of mud. It remembered every birth, every death, every scandal whispered behind closed doors, and every secret buried under floorboards. But most of all, more than any drought, any flood, any tragedy the years had thrown at it, Redemption Creek remembered Elias Cole. Not because he asked it to. Not because he ever stood in the town square and demanded respect or recognition. In fact, Elias Cole had spent the last 11 years doing the exact opposite. He had retreated to the edges of everything, to that old porch, to that creaking rocking chair, to that tin coffee mug he refilled exactly twice a day, trying his absolute best to be forgotten. The town simply refused to oblige. Old Martha Hensley, who ran the dry goods store on the corner of Main and 2nd, had been in Redemption Creek for 63 of her 71 years. She had seen sheriffs come and go. She had seen outlaws hang and gamblers cheat and preachers sin. She had seen this town at its worst and at its most glorious, and she kept all of it locked inside her chest like coins in a strongbox. But whenever strangers rolled into town, which happened more and more these days, now that the railroad was pushing closer and land speculators were circling like patient vultures, Martha had one ritual she never skipped. She would walk to the window of her store, lean on the frame, and watch them. Watch their eyes. Watch the moment they noticed the old man on the porch at the end of the street. Most of them laughed. That was the first mistake. They saw what anyone would see on the surface. A man in his late 70s, maybe older, with a face so deeply lined it looked like cracked leather left in the sun too long. White hair, thin at the temples. Shoulders that had once been broad but now carried the gentle curve of age. Hands wrapped around a coffee mug like they needed something to hold on to. Boots worn down to nothing at the heel. They saw an old man. Harmless. Forgotten. Past his time. Martha would watch them laugh, and she would feel something move through her chest. Not quite sadness, not quite fear. Something older than both. Something that lived in the space between what people could see and what they could not. Because Martha Hensley had been standing in that same store window 39 years ago, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when Elias Cole had first ridden into Redemption Creek. He had not been old then. He had been 34 years old, straight-backed in the saddle, with those same pale gray eyes scanning the street with the quiet, measuring patience of a man who had learned, the hard way, in the worst possible classrooms, that any person you underestimated might be the last person you ever saw. He had ridden in alone. He had ridden in with nothing but a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver that sat low on his hip like it had grown there, and a reputation that had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 weeks before he did. The reputation had come in the form of a letter. The letter had come from a sheriff in a town called Bitterwell, 200 miles east, and it had been addressed to Redemption Creek's mayor at the time, a portly red-faced man named Gerald Finch, who had read the letter twice, gone very pale, and then locked it in his desk drawer and told nobody about it. But towns talk. Desks get opened. Letters get read by curious eyes. And so by the time Elias Cole rode down Main Street on that October afternoon, every soul in Redemption Creek knew at least part of the story. They knew he had been a lawman once. A good one. The kind that cleaned up towns other sheriffs wouldn't touch, that walked into saloons where four-armed men sat waiting and walked back out again while the four-armed men did not. They knew he had resigned his badge under circumstances nobody fully understood and nobody fully agreed on. And they knew, because the letter from Bitterwell had been very specific about this particular detail, that in 14 years of working the most violent territories in the western frontier, Elias Cole had been in 31 armed confrontations. 31 confrontations. 0 losses. He had settled in Redemption Creek because it was quiet. Because nobody knew him here, or so he had hoped. Because there was a small house at the edge of town with a porch that faced west. And from that porch you could watch the sun go down over the flat open land. And for a man who had spent 14 years watching his back, watching the sunset felt like the closest thing to peace he could imagine. He had planted a garden. He had learned the names of the neighbors' children. He had put his colt in a wooden box under the floorboards and told himself, quietly, on a Tuesday morning with coffee in his hand and birdsong in the air, that he was done. That chapter was closed. That man was gone. For 11 years, he had almost believed it. And then, on a morning in the spring of his 76th year, 4 strangers had ridden into Redemption Creek. And one of them, the youngest, with boots too new and an attitude too loud, had walked up to Elias Cole's porch, looked down at the old man in the rocking chair, and told him to leave. Martha Hensley had been at her window when it happened. She had not laughed. She had simply reached under her counter, pulled out the worn leather-bound ledger where she kept her accounts, opened it to a fresh page, and written the date at the top. Because in her experience, in 63 years of watching this town breathe and break and rebuild itself, what happened next was always worth recording. They had come from Caldwell. That was the first thing Deputy Russ Haggerty noticed when he saw them ride in, the Caldwell brand. Not on their horses, exactly, but on everything else. The way they sat in their saddles like men who had never been told no. The way their eyes moved across the town not with curiosity but with calculation, pricing everything they saw, measuring everything they passed, like a butcher eyeing cattle before the slaughter. Haggerty was 26 years old and had been deputy of Redemption Creek for 8 months. He was not an unintelligent man. He was not a coward, but he was young enough to still believe that a badge meant something to everyone who saw it, and that belief, that comfortable, dangerous innocence, was about to receive its first serious education. He stepped out of the sheriff's office and onto the boardwalk as the 4 men reined their horses to a stop in front of the saloon. The leader dismounted first. He was not the biggest of the 4. That distinction belonged to a mountain of a man with a red beard and hands like cast-iron skillets who stayed in the saddle a moment longer than the others, eyes sweeping the street with slow, professional patience. But the leader had something the big man didn't. He had the particular stillness of someone who had never once in his adult life doubted that the world would arrange itself around his preferences. His name, Haggerty would learn within the hour, was Douglas Crane. And Douglas Crane worked for Silas Whitmore. The name Silas Whitmore had been moving through the territories like a cold wind for the better part of 5 years. He was not the kind of man who appeared in newspapers. He was careful about that, surgically careful, the way men of real power learn to be. He did not rob banks. He did not shoot people himself. He did not do anything that could be pointed at directly and called a crime. What Silas Whitmore did was buy land. He bought it cheaply when he could. He bought it under pressure when he had to. And when the land he wanted had an owner who was stubborn, or foolish, or simply too attached to what was theirs to be reasonable about it, well, that was what Douglas Crane was for. Crane and his 3 men had ridden into 14 towns in the last 2 years on Whitmore's business. In 11 of those towns, they had gotten what they came for within a week, sometimes within days. The methods varied. Sometimes it was paperwork, documents that appeared legal, drawn up by lawyers Whitmore kept on retainer who specialized in finding the particular angle of pressure that would make a signature appear on a page. Sometimes it was economics, sudden, mysterious difficulties that appeared for local businesses, supplies that stopped arriving, buyers who stopped buying, until the financial discomfort became unbearable and the land changed hands just to make the pain stop. And sometimes, in the remaining 3 towns, it had been something more direct. Haggerty didn't know all of this yet as he watched Crane dismount. He knew pieces of it, rumors wrapped in rumors, the kind of half-stories that traveled faster than facts and arrived more distorted. But he knew enough to feel the particular tightening in his stomach that his body used to tell him that something serious had just ridden into his town. He crossed the street toward them. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice level, his hand loose at his side. "You boys passing through, or planning to stay a while?" Crane looked at him the way a man looks at a fence post, acknowledging its existence without granting it any particular significance. His eyes moved to the badge on Haggerty's chest, registered it, and moved on. "Business," Crane said simply. He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, making a small performance of the slowness, the kind of move designed to make a young deputy aware of exactly how easily it could have been something else, and produced a folded envelope. He held it out. Haggerty took it, opened it, read it twice. It was a land deed, or something that presented itself as one. The language was dense and technical, packed with legal terminology that Haggerty couldn't fully parse on the street in the morning light. But the core of it was clear enough. It claimed ownership, on behalf of a land acquisition company called Western Meridian Holdings, which Haggerty had never heard of but which he would later discover was one of 11 companies that existed solely on paper as a buffer between transactions and Silas Whitmore's name, of a substantial parcel of land on the eastern edge of Redemption Creek. A parcel that included, among other properties, a small house with a westward-facing porch. Elias Cole's house. "This isn't right," Haggerty said. He heard the slight uncertainty in his own voice and hated it. "Mr. Cole has lived on that property for 11 years. He owns it outright. I've seen the deed myself. It's registered at the county office in." "Was registered," Crane said pleasantly. "Tax liens, deputy. Accumulated over several years. When liens go unpaid past a certain threshold, the property enters a legal acquisition process. It's all very standard. Very boring, actually." He said the word boring the way someone might say inevitable. Mr. Cole had notification letters sent to him over the course of 18 months. He chose not to respond. "The acquisition completed 30 days ago. We're simply here to finalize the transition." Haggerty looked at the document again, then at Crane, then at the 3 men still on their horses, the red-bearded giant, a narrow-faced man with quick eyes, and a younger one who couldn't have been more than 22, practically vibrating with some energy that Haggerty recognized instinctively as the particular restlessness of someone hoping things would go badly just so something interesting would happen. "I'll need to verify this with the county office before anyone." "Of course," Crane said agreeably. "Take all the time you need, deputy. We're not in any rush." He smiled then, a clean, practiced smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "We'll just go introduce ourselves to Mr. Cole while you look into it. Neighborly thing to do." Haggerty watched them walk toward the end of the street. He stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which he ran through his options, measured his authority against the thickness of that legal document, calculated the distance between what he felt was wrong and what he could prove was wrong. And then he turned and went back into the sheriff's office to find the telegraph key. Because Sheriff Bill Donnell was in the county seat and needed to know about this immediately. Because something about Douglas Crane's smile had settled into Haggerty's stomach like a stone dropped into still water. And because, though he was young, though he was still learning, though he had only 8 months of experience wearing that badge, Russ Haggerty had grown up in Redemption Creek. He knew whose porch they were walking toward. He knew the name Elias Cole the way every child born in this town knew it, not from any story the old man himself had ever told, because Elias Cole never spoke about any of it. Not once, not to anyone, but from the careful, weighted way the adults spoke it. The way his own father had spoken it once, when Haggerty was 9 years old and had asked why the old man at the end of the street always sat alone. His father had been quiet for a long moment. Then he had said, "Because he's earned the right to, son, and because most men who know his name have enough sense to let him." Haggerty grabbed the telegraph key. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. Douglas Crane had walked into a lot of situations in his life. He had walked into courtrooms and sheriff's offices and crowded saloons and private dining rooms where powerful men made decisions that rearranged other people's lives like furniture. He had walked into confrontations that lesser men would have retreated from, stood in rooms where the air itself felt hostile, delivered news that broke people, financially, emotionally, sometimes in ways that took years to fully understand. And he had done all of it with that same clean, practiced composure that Silas Whitmore paid him handsomely to maintain. He was not, by his own assessment, a man who got nervous. But as he walked down the dusty length of Redemption Creek's main street toward the figure at the end of it, something he would never have named as nervousness, because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required understanding it, began to move quietly through the back of his chest. He told himself it was nothing. The heat, the dust, the particular stillness of a small-town morning that made sounds carry too far and silences feel too heavy. He kept walking. Behind him, his 3 men spread out instinctively, not because anyone had given an order, but because men who do the kind of work they do develop a physical grammar for these moments, a wordless choreography of positioning and spacing that happens automatically, the body doing what experience has taught it without waiting for the mind to catch up. Redbeard, whose actual name was Otto Streck, though nobody had called him that in years, drifted to the left, his hand resting casually on his belt 3 inches from the grip of his revolver. The narrow-faced man, Calhoun, moved right, eyes already quartering the street, checking windows, noting doorways, cataloging exits the way a man catalogs exits when he has needed them before and knows he will need them again. The young one, Jimmy, just Jimmy, no last name anyone had ever successfully attached to him, came up slightly behind Crane, close enough to be useful, far enough not to crowd him. It was a good formation, professional, the kind of thing that happened when 4 men had worked together long enough that the work had gotten into their bones. None of it mattered. Elias Cole did not look up as they approached. That was the first thing that registered, not as a conscious observation but as a physical sensation, a slight wrongness that Crane's body detected before his mind could categorize it. In his experience, people always looked up. It was instinct, biology, the deep animal awareness of approach that no amount of composure could fully suppress. Even the most seasoned men, even the ones who had been in enough situations to have learned stillness, would flick their eyes toward movement, would register the approach, would make some small acknowledgement, a tensing of the shoulders, a shift of the jaw, that said, "I see you coming." The old man on the porch did nothing. He sat in his rocking chair, which was not, Crane noticed as he got closer, actually rocking, with his coffee mug in both hands and his pale gray eyes aimed at the horizon like there was something out there worth watching. His breathing was visible in the slight rise and fall of his chest. Slow, completely, impossibly slow, like a man in the deepest part of sleep, except that his eyes were open and his stillness was not the stillness of unconsciousness. It was the stillness of absolute, total readiness. Crane had seen that stillness once before in his life. Once, in a gambling hole in Tucson, in a man who had 7 guns pointed at him from 3 different directions and who had simply stood there, not frozen, not paralyzed, but present in a way that the 7 men pointing guns at him were not, until the situation resolved itself in his favor through means that Crane still didn't fully understand and had never been able to adequately explain to anyone who hadn't been there. That man had been dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or size or speed. It had been something older than all of those things. He was looking at it again now. "Mr. Cole," Crane said. His voice came out exactly as he intended, level, pleasant, carrying the easy authority of a man who represents legitimate interests and knows it. "My name is Douglas Crane. I represent Western Meridian Holdings, which as of 30 days ago holds legal title to this property. I have documentation if you'd like to review it." Silence. The rocking chair did not move. The coffee mug did not move. The pale gray eyes did not move from the horizon. I understand this may come as a surprise, Crane continued, modulating his tone towards something that suggested sympathetic professionalism. And I want you to know that Western Meridian is prepared to offer a very reasonable transition arrangement, but we have no interest in making this difficult for you, Mr. Cole. We simply need. How old are you, son? The voice was quiet. Not weak, not even slightly weak, but quiet in the way that rivers are quiet when they run very deep. It stopped Crane mid-sentence with the simple authority of a sound that expected to be heard and had never had reason to doubt that it would be. Crane blinked. I beg your pardon. Your age. The old man still hadn't looked at him. How many years have you been alive? I don't see how that's. Humor me. A pause. Crane felt his 3 men watching him, waiting for his lead, and that awareness, the awareness of being watched by his own people, made him answer before he'd fully decided to. 38. Elias Cole was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that might, in different circumstances, have been sadness. 38 years, he said slowly, as if turning the number over, examining its weight. That's a reasonable span of time. Long enough to know better. Long enough to have learned to read a room. A pause. Or a porch. It was Jimmy, young, restless, vibrating with that particular energy of someone for whom this had been taking too long, who made the first real mistake. He stepped forward, past Crane's shoulder, and when he spoke his voice had the bright, performative edge of someone playing to an audience he imagined was watching. Old man, we've been real patient. Mr. Crane's been real polite. But this land ain't yours anymore, and that means this porch ain't yours. And if you don't get yourself up out of that chair in the next 60 seconds, we're gonna have to help you do it. He let his hand drop to his holster, not drawing, not even close to drawing, just resting there. A suggestion, a punctuation mark. You understand what I'm telling you. For the first time, Elias Cole turned his head. He looked at Jimmy with those pale gray eyes, and the look lasted perhaps 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, something happened to Jimmy that he would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and never quite managing to. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear was certainly present. It was something more specific than fear. It was the sudden, absolute, cellular certainty that he was standing in front of something that had existed long before him and would exist long after him and had, in its long existence, already seen and already done and already survived everything that Jimmy might imagine bringing to bear against it. It was the feeling of being very, very small. Jimmy's hand moved away from his holster without him consciously deciding to move it. Your friend, Elias Cole said to Crane, his eyes still on Jimmy, wants to be careful. He paused. Men who put their hands near guns around me tend to find that their hands have made a decision their brain hadn't finished making yet. The street was silent. From somewhere behind them, from the direction of the dry goods store, there was the faint sound of a window being closed. The sound of Redemption Creek removing itself from whatever was about to happen, the way a town learns to do when it has seen enough to know the difference between situations that human intervention can improve and situations that human intervention can only complicate. Crane looked at the old man, looked at the pale gray eyes, now turned back to the horizon as if the last 30 seconds had been a minor interruption in a much longer, more private conversation. He thought about the land deed in his coat pocket. He thought about Silas Whitmore's instructions, which had been clear and had not included provisions for this particular circumstance, because Silas Whitmore, for all his considerable intelligence, had not known whose porch this was. He thought about Tucson, about the gambling hall, about the man with 7 guns pointed at him. Mr. Cole, he said carefully, I don't think you understand the legal position. I understand it perfectly, the old man said quietly. I also understand something you don't. He finally, slowly, set his coffee mug down on the porch railing. The small sound of tin on wood in the morning silence was somehow louder than it had any right to be. You came here thinking this was going to be easy. He looked at Crane then, fully, directly, those pale gray eyes finding his and holding them with a grip that had nothing to do with hands. It isn't going to be easy. Douglas Crane was a man who prided himself on knowing when to press and when to pause. It was perhaps his most valuable professional quality, more valuable than his legal knowledge, more valuable than his physical presence, more valuable even than the 3 armed men he traveled with. The ability to read a moment accurately, to feel the precise temperature of a situation and adjust accordingly, had kept him alive and employed through 14 towns and more difficult conversations than he could count. Every instinct he possessed was currently screaming at him to pause. He ignored them, because Silas Whitmore was not a man who accepted pauses. Because the acquisition timeline had already been communicated to the land company, to the railroad surveyors, to the investors whose money was sitting in accounts drawing interest while this particular transaction remained unfinalized. Because Douglas Crane had built his entire professional identity on the belief that there was no situation that the correct combination of legal documentation, implied threat, and practiced composure could not resolve. And because, though he would never have admitted this, not to his men, not to Whitmore, not to himself in the quiet honesty of 3 in the morning, the old man's certainty had gotten under his skin in a way that made him want to prove something. He straightened, adjusted the front of his coat, produced the land deed from his inside pocket and held it out toward the porch. "Mr. Cole, I'm going to need you to vacate this property by sundown today. That is not a request. That is a legal requirement backed by documentation filed with the territorial court, and your refusal to comply will result in..." Crane. 1 word. His name, nothing else. But something in the register of it, something in the frequency, the texture, the particular quality of absolute calm that carried it, stopped him as completely as a hand placed flat against his chest. Elias Cole had not moved, had not stood, had not reached for anything. He was still seated in that rocking chair, still facing the horizon, his hands now resting open on his knees, palms up, completely empty. "Before you finish that sentence," the old man said quietly, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to look at this street." Crane looked, despite himself. The street was empty, not the ordinary empty of a quiet morning. This was something different, something deliberate. Every door was closed. Every window that had been open was now shut. The saloon, which had been audibly active 20 minutes ago, was silent. Even the horses at the hitching post seemed to have gone still, ears flat, that animal awareness of pressure that precedes storms or violence operating below the threshold of human perception. "This town," Elias Cole said, "has seen enough to know when to be somewhere else. That's not cowardice. That's memory." A pause. "They remember things about me that I've spent 11 years trying to make them forget." Crane recovered himself, looked back at the old man, reminded himself of the facts, the legal facts, the numerical facts, the only facts that ultimately mattered in the modern, civilized, legally structured world that Silas Whitmore had taught him to operate within. An old man, alone, without, as far as he could see, so much as a weapon within reach. "Otto," he said. Red-bearded Otto Streck stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the porch steps. He was 6'4" and 260 pounds, and had never in his professional life encountered a physical situation he could not resolve through the simple application of his considerable size. He looked at the old man in the rocking chair the way a mountain looks at a stone, with a complete indifference of something that does not recognize anything in front of it as a meaningful obstacle. He put one boot on the bottom porch step. Elias Cole's eyes moved to him. Just his eyes, nothing else moved. Not his head, not his shoulders, not his hands still resting open on his knees. Just those pale gray eyes, sliding smoothly to Otto Streck and settling on him with an attention so focused and so complete that Otto, who had never in his adult life taken a backward step from anything, felt his boot come back off the porch step without his brain having issued the relevant instruction. He stood there for a moment, genuinely confused by what his own body had just done. "Son," Elias Cole said to Otto, his voice carrying no heat whatsoever. "The last man who came up these steps uninvited was a cattle rustler named Price out of New Mexico Territory. That was 1987. He was 31 years old, which was a shame, because he might have amounted to something given time." A pause so slight it was almost not a pause at all. He didn't get the time. Otto looked at Crane. Crane looked at the old man that it was Calhoun, narrow-faced, quick-eyed, the most genuinely dangerous of the four in the way that compact, watchful men with fast hands often are, who changed the nature of the situation. He had been standing to the right, cataloging, measuring, running his own private calculations with the focused efficiency of a man whose survival has always depended on being faster than the other person's decision. And what Calhoun had calculated, standing there in the morning quiet of Redemption Creek's main street, was that the old man was bluffing. Had to be bluffing, because Calhoun was fast. Genuinely, verifiably fast. He had proven it 9 times in situations where the proof had been absolute and final. And the old man had no weapon visible. No holster, no rifle within reach. His hands were open on his knees, for God's sake, palms up, 10 feet away, separated from any possible response by the distance between the rocking chair and the porch railing and the steps and the ground where Calhoun was standing. The math was simple. The math was, in Calhoun's professional assessment, completely in his favor. He drew. What happened next lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. It was described afterward by the only truly neutral witness, a traveling merchant named Aldous Fry who had been watching from the narrow gap between the feed store and the barber shop, frozen in place by the particular paralysis that grips bystanders when violence becomes suddenly, undeniably imminent, in terms that he admitted were inadequate, because language, he said, had not been designed to describe something that moved faster than the eye could follow and was over before the mind could properly begin to process that it had started. What Aldous Fry said, when Deputy Haggerty found him an hour later sitting on a barrel outside the feed store with the color gone from his face, was this. The old man didn't stand up. That's the part one keep coming back to. He didn't stand up. He didn't lunge forward. He didn't do any of the things a man does when he's moving fast and urgent. He just shifted, like something that had been coiled so long it had forgotten it was coiled until the moment came. And then it just released. And his hand went somewhere inside that vest, somewhere I hadn't even noticed there was somewhere to go. And then there was a sound, and then it was over. Calhoun's gun was on the ground. Calhoun's hand was pressed against his right shoulder, and his face had the specific expression of a man who has just had a fundamental assumption about the world corrected in the most immediate and educational way possible. He was alive. The shot, and it had been a shot, one shot, from a short-barreled Colt that had apparently lived inside Elias Cole's vest in a shoulder holster for 11 years like a retired soldier still sleeping in uniform, had taken him in the shoulder with a precision that was either extraordinary marksmanship or something so far beyond marksmanship that it required a different word entirely. It had been designed to disable, not to kill. That was the detail that Aldous Fry kept returning to, kept emphasizing, in every retelling. Because hitting a moving target, a drawing target, in the shoulder rather than the chest, from a seated position, with a short-barreled revolver, in the time between a man's hand moving toward his gun and the gun clearing the holster, was not something that happened by accident. It happened because the man doing the shooting had decided, in the fraction of a second available for decisions, exactly where he wanted the bullet to go, and had put it there. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence that had preceded it. Jimmy had not moved. His hands were raised slightly, not fully up but elevated, his body making the instinctive gesture of a man who wants to be very clearly understood to not be doing anything. Otto Streck had stepped back 2 full paces and was standing very still with his massive hands open at his sides, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man revising an entire category of assumptions. Douglas Crane had not moved at all. He was looking at Elias Cole, who had returned to his original position, seated, hands resting on his knees, eyes on the horizon, as completely and naturally as if the last 90 seconds had been a brief interruption in a longer stillness. The short-barreled Colt was nowhere visible. Wherever it had come from, it had returned there, as quietly and efficiently as it had appeared. "Your man needs a doctor," Elias Cole said. His voice was exactly as it had been at the beginning of the conversation. Quiet, deep, carrying the absolute calm of something that has nothing left to prove. "Dr. Hennessy is on the corner of 3rd and Mill. Tell him Elias sent you. He'll take care of the shoulder." Crane found his voice. It took a moment. What you just did, this is assault. This is Self-defense, said a new voice. Haggerty had come back. He was standing at the edge of the street with Sheriff Bill Donnell beside him. Donnell, who had been in the county seat, who had received the telegraph, who had ridden back to Redemption Creek at a speed that suggested the telegraph had communicated urgency with sufficient clarity. Donnell was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a gray mustache and the particular unhurried authority of a man who has been doing his job long enough to have stopped feeling the need to perform it. He was also holding a telegraph response from the county land office. "Land deeds fraudulent," Donnell said pleasantly, walking forward. He nodded at Crane. "Turns out the tax lien documentation was filed using a clerical error in the county records that your employer's lawyers apparently helped create. County attorney's already been notified. Territorial Marshal's office has been telegraphed." He stopped in front of Crane and held out a hand. "I'll take that deed, Mr. Crane." It took another hour for everything to resolve itself in the practical sense. For Calhoun to be walked to Dr. Hennis's office, for Crane and Otto and Jimmy to be escorted to the sheriff's office where their particulars were recorded and a formal report was begun that would eventually contribute to a territorial investigation into Western Meridian Holdings and, through it, to the slow, careful unraveling of several layers of Silas Whitmore's land acquisition operation. None of that is the part of the story that Redemption Creek remembered. What Redemption Creek remembered, what Martha Hensley wrote in her leather ledger, what Aldous Fry told in every town he passed through for the next 20 years, what Deputy Haggerty described to his own children decades later when they asked him about the most important thing he had ever witnessed, was what happened after. After Crane and his men were gone. After Donnell had clapped Haggerty on the shoulder and told him he'd done good work with the telegraph. After the street had slowly, cautiously, begun to reopen, doors unlocking, windows lifting, the ordinary sounds of a town resuming its ordinary life like an orchestra finding its way back to a melody after a long, dissonant interruption. Haggerty had walked to the end of the street, had stood at the bottom of the porch steps, had looked up at Elias Cole, who was back in his rocking chair, actually rocking now, a slow, gentle rhythm, with a fresh cup of coffee in both hands and his pale gray eyes on the horizon. "Mr. Cole," Haggerty said. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to say after that. There were too many things, gratitude, questions, something that felt almost like but was quieter than all, more personal. "I just wanted to. I don't know. Say something." Elias Cole looked at him. Those pale gray eyes, warm now in a way they hadn't been an hour ago, settled on the young deputy with something that might have been, in a different man, paternal affection. "You did good today, son," the old man said simply. "That telegraph was the right call. Always better to solve things with paper than with lead." A pause. "Remember that." Haggerty nodded, stood there another moment. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Were you—" He stopped. Started again. "When Calhoun drew, were you scared?" Elias Cole was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Haggerty thought the question might go unanswered. Then the old man looked back at the horizon, and something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite sadness, something in between that belonged to a man carrying a very long history in a very quiet way. "Son," he said softly, "the last time I was scared was 1879. Man named Calloway in a town called Dust River." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "I was scared because I didn't know if I was good enough yet." Another pause. "I found out." He rocked gently in his chair. "After that," he said, "it was never fair. Just arithmetic." The sun moved west, as it always did, and Elias Cole sat on his porch, in his rocking chair, coffee in hand, watching it go. The last living gunslinger, in the town that had refused to forget him, on the porch that 4 strangers had tried to take, and one old man had kept without ever once raising his voice. The rocking chair creaked. The town breathed, and the horizon, as always, held its silence. End.